a wake-up call for Europe, which is a survey the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung did in 7 countries. I'm coming to that in a sec. First of all, I would like to welcome the panel. Alexandra Dienes from the office, the newly established office and small think tank of the FES in Vienna, the Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace. Dr. Alexandra Dienes, and also Dr. Tamar Pataraia from the Institute for Democracy and Euro-Atlantic Studies. She's on the board, and she has done many, many things. Because you know this, and I'm sure your fellow Georgians know this all, I'm not want to tell you all that. It's just amazing what you have done. Also, before I start, there is one technical announcement. After this panel, which lasts until 12 o'clock, there is no break. You have the opportunity to stay here, and then you join session number 7, Noteworthy, Media Shaping Security in Progress, or you can leave and go to room number 5, which is a breakout session on changing US-Turkey relations and implication for the South Caucasus. My name is Reinhard Krumm. I'm the head of the office in Vienna. And I will give you a short introduction to the survey. Then Alexandra Dienes will lead you through the service. And then we have the comment from Georgia. I will go through 4 points. Why a survey and a summary. Second, how do we do it? Third, what do we want to achieve? And the fourth one is what's next. Now, why a survey? I think that's a clear, you could expect a clear answer why this is important to ask the people. I would like to use a metaphor to explain this. And I'm copying kind of a famous essay from Isaiah Berlin from England. He wrote this in the 50s, I think, on the 60s, about the fox and the hedgehog. The hedgehog is the small prickly thing which goes very, very slowly. And according to him and according to Greek mythology, the hedgehog knows everything, the big thing. One big thing, that's what he does. The strategy. And the fox, the fast one, he knows many things. So if you look for a strategy how to go from point A to point B, you need the hedgehog because he shows you the way. He's the strategist. But if you want to know how to avoid water, desert, whatever is between point A and B, you need the fox. And using this metaphor, I think a survey like this is good for decision makers to know what their people think. And this should be part of decision making. I know this is a very ideal understanding because we all know that foreign policy usually is not on high priority of politicians because they have to look for domestic politics and how they get voted into parliament. And I'm talking about parliamentarians. But you have to know what people think. How do we do it? We chose 7 countries, and I'm coming back to a minute who those are. And we asked a fairly big institution in Germany, in France, which has partners in those countries to do it. We asked 1,000 people. It's representative, by the way. So no questions if we only ask the elite or only the village. It's the representative survey, so we asked all of them. 7,000 altogether. That's the one pillar this one is standing on. The second one is that we also asked focus groups in the 7 countries. We asked to see how the general discourse in these countries are. The 7 countries are Germany, France, because we thought we asked the people of 2 bigger EU countries. We could have asked Britain too, but Britain is out and in and out, so we didn't really know. So we asked not Britain or the Brits. Then we have Poland, which is the biggest Eastern Central European country. We asked Latvia, which is in an area which could be seen as volatile. It has been part of the Soviet Union. It didn't want to be, but it was. Then Russia and Ukraine, I think this is self-explanatory. and Serbia just to have a country from the Western Balkan with special relationships with Russia to see how they answer our questions. Georgia is not on it, but this doesn't mean that the next time Georgia will not be part of it. That we have to see. The question is, what do we want to achieve? Except this lovely publication, by the way, which is down here. We put it here so you don't look through when we present, but after that you can get them. Also, it's available electronically. So what do we want with this? We would like to have to initiate a more open and critical discussion of the current security and foreign policy situation in Europe. You can argue, well, we have this, don't we? In a way we have it, but on the other hand, we have heard the word many times today, and this is, I think, the word of the last decade, bubbles. Usually you are in your bubble and you're discussing very seriously within the bubble, but if you ask people, they're partly outside of all this, and they give more input. So it is to have this open discussion, that's one thing. Second is to give decision makers another foundation, like Foxes do, to have a understanding what the people want. How do they look at it? Third one is, in general, put security policy back on the political agenda. We had this in the 70s and 80s, no doubt. In the 90s, it was dying down. Faculties were closed. Journalists are not dealing with security policy as they did in the 80s and 70s and 80s. So it has to come back, and politicians have to take this very, very seriously. And the last one is have the public involved. Recently, a former German ambassador to China has published a book which is called The Clueless Foreign Policy, meaning we don't really have any answers to the challenges we have. This is, of course, a very general judgment, I understand. There are very smart people out there. But one of his ideas is have the public more involved, somehow. And if you look to the spectrum of democratic or Democrats in the US, one of their understanding is we need to involve the public more on foreign policy. It's not right at the moment. Possibly the Republicans are doing that too, but it's something which comes up. So this is the fourth point we would like to have. And the last one, the next steps. So far we have presented this at the Munich Security Conference. We have done this in Vienna with the Secretary General of the OSCE. We've been to Moscow, we've been to Germany again, we've been to Budapest, now we're here. And we'll continue this, especially in those countries where we have asked the population, but not only. Possibly the last stop will be then Washington. And out of all this, out of this discussion, then we'll have a policy paper, 2-3 pages, and give to decision makers, as long as they're interested. And understand this rightly, this is not only going towards Germany. This is going also to your people here, to Poland. European security is nothing which one country can evolve in. This has to be quite a different approach. The approaches we had in the past partly worked, but partly didn't, as we see today. Okay, so this was the actually not so short introduction, but now Andrea and Alexandra Dienes will get you through the survey, and then we have the commentary.
Thank you, Reinhard. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us. I'm happy to share the results of the survey with you, so pretty much what the Fox found out, so to speak. Let's go straight to the challenges to European security. And this is the average of all people that we ask. And you see the status quo is pretty grim. People are afraid. 69% fear that wars and other conflicts will affect their own country. And almost half of the surveyed population think that new wars in Europe are likely against the backdrop of Russia-West tensions. This is a pretty worrying status quo, and this is for us kind of the starting point to dig deeper and look how the foreign policy perceptions of the people exactly are, which countries are they afraid of, which solutions they see to some of the most pressing things. But this is the grim kind of starting point that I would like to draw your attention to. if we ask about threatening actors, no more surprising perhaps, those figures that you see, both Russia and the United States, on average, among those 7,000 people surveyed in our 7 countries, see both Russia and the United States as threatening actors, threatening European security. And you see the United States got even a higher value. Of course, you can speculate whether it's the Trump factor, but at least as of the security radar of 2019, that's the status quo. Those 2 countries are seen as threats to European security. I will occasionally cite some of the Georgian figures just because we're in Georgia now, and I suppose it's interesting for all of us. In Georgia, and here I draw on CRC survey, the most recent figures that I found on similar questions is from 2017. Also about 40% think that Russia is a threatening actor, and I think just a single-digit number think that the US is a threatening actor. So here the picture is quite different. Well, this is my favorite slide about the enemies. Here the question was phrased slightly differently, not in who is the threat to European security, but which country do you think is a threat to your own country? And the question was phrased in an open manner, so people could just name countries, and the more often the country was named, the bigger the font. So just take a look. You see there are many more countries that are being feared, more than just Russia and the US. I will draw your attention to a couple of things that we found interesting. For example, you see in Germany a quite surprising, perhaps, fear of Turkey, China, North Korea. Then if you look at France, the fear of Syria, or again China, is perhaps somewhat surprising. In Poland, Poles are again afraid of Germany. The font is pretty small, so the fear of Russia is of course way, way bigger, but some of the old dividing lines or perhaps fears are coming up. Serbia stands out as the country who names most of the enemies. You see there are plenty of them. Again, perhaps it's a legacy of the Balkan Wars. All right. Low trust in institutions. We would like to frame it here as a threat, or at least as a challenge to European security. You can see that across the board, again, this is the average of all respondents, but it's fairly similar across countries. Parties, the media, government are least trusted. I looked up the Georgian figures. Here you see only 18% trust parties. In Georgia, it's even less. It's something, again, single digit, people who trust parties. Government, 38%. In Georgia, it's about the same. Head of state, 46%. In Georgia, the president has a similar approval rating. And then a striking fact, which says something about status quo of our societies, perhaps in Europe, that force ministries, so to speak, police, military, intelligence services, they are highly trusted. So civilian institutions are actually trusted much less than the military and the force institutions. Again, I looked up the Georgian figures, and it's a fairly similar picture. So the military and the police are being trusted very, very highly. This is an interesting slide that I would like to dwell upon. This is the question about status and how satisfied or dissatisfied countries are with their international standing. So the question was phrased, my country does not have the status in the world it deserves in comparison with other countries. And here what we see, the least satisfied are the eastern countries, so to speak. Serbia is dissatisfied with the status, 85%. Then we have Ukraine, Poland, Russia, 56%. Latvia, also about half of the population, are not satisfied with the status. And then you have France and Germany, the Western European countries that are fairly relaxed. So here it's interesting to see that even like a country like Latvia, who is a member of the EU, a member of NATO, it's still dissatisfied with its status. And there was another similarly phrased question, I think that other countries prevent my country from achieving its true greatness, and here we also see this kind of east-west divide. I can only speculate where Georgia would have been, but I suppose it could have joined this eastern camp, so to speak, of somewhat less satisfied countries. And this does have, of course, security repercussions or influence on on foreign policy that the countries pursue. Well, another challenge, at least we phrase it as a challenge, is the attitude towards increased military spending. So here you see the percentage points of people approving the statement that my country should increase its military spending. And again, somewhat similar to the status distribution, you see countries in the so-called East wanting to increase military spending. First of all, Serbia, then Poland, surprisingly, perhaps Ukraine. Russia, that we fear is building up its military and perhaps is a very threatening actor. Only about half of the population actually are in favor of increasing military spending. And then again, France and Germany somewhat less inclined to want to increase military spending. Again, have a look perhaps at Latvia. NATO member, somewhat more relaxed maybe about military spending, but still 45% wanting to increase military spending. Okay, now I move to a somewhat more optimistic part of the findings of the survey. Next to the challenges, we found out something as we would frame as opportunities. Opportunities in terms of working together for building a European security order. So you see across the board, there's a very strong realization that the prosperity of my own country is linked to the well-being and positive developments in other countries. Here I would like to highlight Latvia and Ukraine as kind of the top and the low in terms of approval rating. As Reinhard was mentioning, Latvia can be considered as part of a historically volatile Baltic region, and it realizes its interconnectedness, its interdependence with its neighbors very much. And Ukraine is somewhat surprising. You see just, so to speak, just 61%, lower than in other places, think that interdependence is important. Maybe it's linked to the realization that Ukraine doesn't have real allies, rather partners. This is something we heard in the expert discussion. And this Ukrainian self-reliance is something that goes through the survey as a golden thread. I will point out a few figures later as well. Okay, yet again, an opportunity, active foreign policy. Again, across the board, populations in the countries surveyed support the statement that their country should pursue an active foreign policy, play a significant role in solving international problems, crises, and conflicts. Here, the top values are in Russia and Poland. 83%, both in Russia and Poland, want their countries to pursue active foreign policy. And in the Russian case, it perhaps might not surprise against the backdrop of Russia's recent, let me put it in this way, kind of activity in foreign policy. But in Poland, it's perhaps a bit unexpected because we haven't seen so far that this support translates into particularly active Polish foreign policy. But again, the expert discussion that we conducted on top of the representative public opinion poll gave us a hint or a hunch, a suggestion. Perhaps Poland views itself as a leader of its region, Visegrad, maybe the Baltic, but wants to play in a higher league together, for instance, with France and Germany, and in this sense have a more active foreign policy, have more say. Again, Ukraine looks 78% want to pursue active foreign policy. This is also part of this self-reliance, being active agency. We also asked about the role of international organizations such as the United Nations, the EU, or the OSCE. We first asked how big the influence of such organizations is, and also whether the people knew the organization. Obviously, fewer people know the organizations like the OSCE or the CSTO, the Eurasian Economic Union. And then those who knew the organizations, we asked the question, which of them actually should play a bigger role? And here you see that multilateral inclusive organizations such as the UN, the EU, the OSCE, populations put their trust in them and want them to play a bigger role in the future. For NATO, you see, for instance, 52%. Of course, you could conclude population think that NATO already plays a big role and doesn't want a higher role in the future. That's perhaps just an interpretation. But that's how it looks for for our countries. Given all this preparedness to conduct active foreign policy, we would like to present you a few figures. We have many, many more in the report in terms of attitudes to the most pressing and acute conflict in Europe, arguably the conflict in and around Ukraine. Here we asked all respondents about the solutions. If you look at the top part of the slide, as possible solutions was named, or we asked people to assess the UN mission, the so-called Blue Helmet mission. You see about half of the population support this idea. Figures differ across the countries. So for example, let me have a look just briefly. I think in Russia it's about 1/3 of the population who support this. Sorry, I can't find it right now. Anyway, these are kind of general figures. Of course, they differ a little bit among the countries. We can look into this later if you want to know more exact figures. Another option to react to the Ukrainian crisis would be to increase sanctions against Russia. 1/3 of the population support it. There are countries like Germany where it's just, if I remember correctly, about 17% who support increasing sanctions. There are countries like Ukraine and Poland where 2/3 of the population think that sanctions needs to be increased. If you look at the bottom of the slide, these are Ukrainian figures, so percentage of Ukrainian respondents. And we asked the question, which is also pretty interesting for the Georgian discourse, about the EU and NATO membership. How do people think about that? And you see that 73% of Ukrainians want their country to become member of the EU, and comparatively much less, 56%, want their country to become a member of NATO. And here, if we look at the Georgian figures, well, you probably know it better than I do. But for example, the EU membership, it's being supported by almost 70%. Yeah, 70% support Georgian EU membership. And for NATO, it's a bit less. About 40% support, at least according to the poll that I saw at CRC, rather support and fully support, and partly support, partially don't support, 26%. You see in this poll, we didn't include this middle category, so we had a 4 scale. You have to either agree strongly or somewhat, or disagree. Maybe we can discuss, you are the experts in the audience, how it pans out in Georgia. Back to Ukraine. A very interesting figure that struck us, this is why we put it here in the slide, is the 63% that think that the Ukrainian conflict is a domestic matter and its solution should be left to Ukraine. This is the centerpiece of this Ukrainian self-reliance that I was mentioning. I leave it as it is. We can discuss later what it can mean and why Ukraine puts such a big emphasis on its own agency. I think this is very interesting also if we compare with the Caucasian region in terms of resolution of the conflicts. Okay, and this is kind of a sum up slide because based on all those questions, and again we showed you just the tip of the iceberg, we had many, many more questions. We tried to kind of sum up which countries can be, or which groups of countries can be the drivers for the, maybe not a European security architecture, but a process towards thinking about a European security architecture, to formulate it a bit softly. And here we plotted 2 questions, and these are the perceived status on the horizontal line. So my country does not deserve the status in the world. Does not have the status in the world that it deserves. And the other axis is responsibility. Here the question was framed, my country should take more international responsibility and help other states, even if this does not bring a direct benefit to my country. So you see it's a pretty specific formulation of responsibility, but we decided to take this particular question just for illustrative purposes. So we have kind of four quadrants or 4 groups of countries. So first let's have a look at France and Germany. They are very content with their status and they also want to take more international responsibility. We call them responsible to lead. Another group of countries, we call them anxious because they're not satisfied with their international status, but want to play a bigger role, want to take more international responsibility. It's Serbia, Ukraine, Poland, and Latvia. And my tentative hunch, even though we didn't include Georgia, that Georgia might perhaps fall into this category. Russia falls into the frustrated part. It's not satisfied with its international status and does not want to take more international responsibility, at least in terms of how we framed this question now. The good news is that we have no isolationists. Well, this is a kind of illustrative tool, and of course you shouldn't see it as cast in stone. What I would like to emphasize that, of course, depending on the questions, sometimes, for example, Latvia or Ukraine, they kind of oscillate between the Russian and the German, French attitudes. So there is some room for maneuver. At the same time, we can work with this tool because also, if we have a look at other questions, those response patterns are similar. So countries do fall often in these groups. So based on this analysis, just 3 short takeaways that we elaborate in our report based, again, on the survey and the focus group discussions with experts. What can we do if we were to start this political process towards a joint European security order? So first of all, what follows from the survey, you have seen people are very concerned in terms of security. We need to take security perceptions of others seriously. This means that Russia needs to take security perceptions of its neighbors seriously because they're grounded in long history. But also some of Russians' threat perceptions, they deserve as being treated seriously, even if they're proclaimed by the biggest country in the world. The second point is looking for compromises. This sounds somewhat obvious, but again, this is based on the survey, so we were ourselves positively surprised to find out that people are ready for dialogue. People show that they're ready for compromise. They support, didn't show you the questions, but they support peaceful resolution of conflicts. They support active foreign policy. So interests are probably easier to reconcile than threat perceptions. So we should talk about interests, negotiate about them, and take it from there. The third point, respecting international norms, also pretty obvious. And it also, luckily, so to speak, came out of the survey. People support peaceful norms and behavior that are connected to international norms. You also have seen that international organizations poll very well. They also stand for the rules-based, norms-based order. Of course, you could say that upholding norms is tricky, and perhaps a unilateral confirmation or affirmation of norms that we already agreed upon could be a helpful step. And then new norms can be agreed upon based on the new compromises. So this is it. You can see many more results than in our publication. I would like to sum up that we see this survey as a wake-up call because the situation is pretty dire. People are afraid, people are worried, but they're willing to cooperate, they're willing to be open for dialogue, compromise. So in a way, it's now up to the politicians to follow through. So thank you very much, and I pass over to our commentator, maybe to bring in more of a Georgian perspective and discuss those findings in the Georgian context. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Reinhard, for giving me this opportunity. I would like to say that this is a very interesting study, and I would like to thank all authors of these initiatives and also researchers who took part in this research for this interesting and for this important and interesting findings and analysis, of course. So the main outcomes of the survey gave us plenty of food for thought and opportunities to analyze what kind of impact it may have over Georgia's security and foreign policy. We may propose or initiate some ideas on proposals how to adjust or improve this foreign policy priorities and objectives for Georgia. So first of all, it is interesting. There are several factors why this research is interesting for Georgian public, policymakers, experts. A survey explores the perceptions and attitudes, values of European states and the population of European states. And especially it is important that if we take into account current security dynamics, and 5 years have passed since eruption of conflict in Ukraine and annexation of Crimean territories. And also it is, so the selection of states are very relevant for Georgia as well. We see here very important partners of Georgia, for first of all, Germany, France, Poland, Latvia. All of these states contributed a lot in state building process, in institution building in Georgia, democratization process during the last decades, and in different occasions in the framework of different organizations and on bilateral cooperation frameworks as well. So I think the perception of respondents from Germany, France, Poland and Latvia are very important for Georgians to know. We have here also Russia, which is perceived in Georgia as a threat for its security, and Russia has occupied Georgian territories for the last decade, more than last decade, and 20% of its territories have been occupied by Russia. We see here Serbia, which is a very interesting example because 10 years ago, this Kosovo independence and the recognition of Kosovan independence played crucial role in the eruption of conflict in Georgia in itself in 2008. Also, the timing of the survey is also very important because, and essential because, according to international experts, public perceptions related to European security matters now resembles those which were prevailed during the Cold War. And the authors of the research very rightly stated that even though there are far fewer weapons, nuclear and conventional weapons on its territory, Europe appears to be in a worse situation today than it was during the Cold War. And I think that it's a very relevant comment because security and foreign policy challenges facing Europe today directly affects Georgia's security and foreign policy choices and directions. So several years ago we studied this voting practice of Georgia, and it seems that those decisions made in the foreign and security policy resemble those which are made by EU member states mostly. For example, we can bring here this voting practice at the UN General Assembly sessions when we see very high level of incoherence between Georgia's voting practice and those of European member states. And also we know that foreign and policy statements, Georgia tries to align itself with those of EU CFSP statements. And it is very observable since this European neighborhood policy was and the Eastern Partnership Initiative was launched 10 years ago. So, and very shortly, I would like to list several factors which are characterizing this security dynamics in Europe and security situation in Europe. So, and how it is seen from Georgia. So currently, due to the withdrawal of main parties from the main arms control agreements, these agreements are collapsing, which makes security, which negatively affects security affairs in Europe, of course. And we see here that due to the collapse of the bilateral negotiation frameworks between US and Russia, both of them now are emphasizing the role of nuclear weapons in their military doctrines, and this factor also is affecting the overall security in the world. We see new military installations, air defense system, new generations of arms systems installed in and around Europe. We talked here yesterday about militarization of the Black Sea area. One of the main factors could be also Cold War norms and shared understandings are becoming less relevant, as it was mentioned by authors of and analysts of this survey. And finally, military confrontation cannot be ruled out because we have already here ongoing conflicts in Eastern Ukraine, annexed territories in Crimea, occupied territories in Georgia, and so on. So finally, consequently, the probability of launching this military conflict increases compared to the years of 90s and beginning of 2000s. And like Ukraine, Georgia also considers its main threat emanating from Russia's aggressive policy, its efforts to carry out a hybrid war, use political and economic leverages, spread propaganda and fake news, and manipulate public opinions. So, and now back to the survey outcomes. So in this context, the first issue I would like to address relate to European security affairs and the response of respondents about this topic. The survey outcomes show that European citizens think that new wars in Europe are unlikely and worry that their own country could be affected. In particular, US and Russia are perceived as a threat in Germany and France. Even worse, half of German respondents think that US is a threat to security in Europe, less so in France, but this figure in France stands at 43%, which is well ahead of any threat perceived as posed by Russia in Germany and in France. Even NATO enlargement and EU enlargement are perceived as threats to European security. Of course, Poland and Latvia, perceptions of Polish and Latvian people, and also other respondents in Ukraine demonstrate different opinion, but this overall situation can become a strong concern for Georgia. At least two serious factors may be identified which explain the impact on Georgian security. So we know that US is a Georgian strategic partner, and Georgia is in a desperate need to keep strong allies on its side to neutralize the threats coming from Russian hybrid war and Russian policies towards occupied territories. Accordingly, the increase of divergence between US and EU member states can negatively affect Georgia's security, its international stance and role, as it may become more difficult for the EU and the US to carry out common policies towards strengthening Georgia's national security, as it was the case during the last years. On the other hand, Georgia needs the international community to help safeguard peace and take measures to integrate the country. According to the respondents' answer, it can be expected that US and EU policies toward Georgia may lose coherence and complementarity, which have been enjoyable features for the Western development policy in the last decade. And also, the escalation of tension between Russia and the West, on the other hand, increases the risk of new wars in Europe, which also of course affects security risks facing Georgia right now. And I would like to address also this Ukrainian perception issues. This is, I think, very important. The point that Ukrainian respondents, 63% of them think that conflict in and around Ukraine are domestic matter and should be left to Ukraine. It should be quite a strong concern for Georgia, but I think partially it is the impact of this Budapest Memorandum and the failure of these guarantees from the Western, from Russia, US, the UK, on withdrawal of nuclear weapons from Ukraine also played a great role in developing this kind of perceptions among Ukrainians. They may lose trust in Western countries who took responsibility to support Ukrainian independence and territorial integrity. So this kind of approach goes contrary to Georgian overall policy options toward occupied territories, because Ukrainians believe that bilateral negotiation is somehow should be supported with Russia. It looks quite questionable for Georgia. Also, Ukrainians' perception, in addition, estimates and perceptions are shared by European Union as well, that the 45% of respondents of the whole survey think that all this dispute is a matter between Ukraine and Russia, and no third party should be intervened in this. And also, only 32% of respondents think that they support expansion of sanctions against Russia. So all of this make it clear that Georgia needs to work a lot more and to do more to intensify its efforts with the Western community and engage them in the negotiation process in dealing with the conflict regions and occupied territories. And Georgia cannot expect that West will confront Russia in the nearest future and respond to on this hybrid warfare and aggressive policies towards Georgia. And my final comment will be that, about the whole Georgian public expert community, that they may learn a lot about from this kind of survey and contribute to the adjustment of Georgians' foreign and security policy. And it would be a great value. Finally, I would add that for Georgia and EU member states to link these affairs of Ukrainian and Georgian affairs about conflict all together, and next time, so especially at the time when this effects of hybrid war and the interventionist policy of Russia is on the rise, and so Europe is also very much concerned with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have the comment from Georgia. Thank you very much. We also have quite a bit of numbers. I'm in the hybrid role of being a moderator and somebody who has to answer for this survey too. But I will give the word first to Alexandra, who I think picked one or two.
Yeah, bear with me that I don't have all the numbers from the top of my head, but I looked up a few of them to address your very interesting questions. So maybe to keep a pick on... Did it go away? Yeah, but Serbia and Latvia, and whether they distort, whether this would lead to contradictory results, asking about Russia and the US being a threat. I just give you a few concrete figures from, let's start with Latvia. So 36% of Latvians think that Russia is a threat. 10% think that the US is a threat. In Serbia, very low figures for Russia being a threat, USA 26%. But a more interesting question, and this was the one that we referred to in the PowerPoint, is whether Russia or the United States is seen not just as a threat to your country, but to European security. And here indeed, another question asks about why Russians are afraid of Russia. Even in Russia, 12% think that Russia is a threat to security in Europe. Perhaps it coincides somewhat with those approximately 10% who think that Crimea was annexed illegally. Even in Russia, there are people who think so. My response is that I don't think that Latvian or Serbian answers distort or produce contradictory results, because we see in both countries that there's a substantial realization that both Russia and the US can be seen as a threat. So, for example, in Latvia, 50% think that Russia is a threat to security in Europe. In Serbia, 23% think that Russia is a threat to security in Europe. And the United States, in Latvia, 47% think that the United States is a threat to security in Europe, and in Serbia, 71%. So, of course, if you take average numbers, fine differences between the countries disappear, but what I think holds across all countries, that both Russia and the US are considered as serious threats. And yeah, even in Russia itself, there's a certain realization that Russia might be not the most constructive actor in terms of European security. I would like to thank David for Georgian numbers. I think it's very interesting to compare different polls, because I think another panel mentioned it. If you ask just about NATO membership, yes or no, with maybe a 5 scale, you might get different responses than if you offer people a third option. And this CRC poll from 2017 that I was referred to actually included in one of the formulations of the question a third option, and there was a bigger majority among Georgians for good relations with both NATO, Western-led alliance, and CSTO, Russian-led alliance. A bigger proportion of people thought it was a good idea than joining NATO. So it just depends perhaps on the formulation of the question, and we keep on following those important numbers and how they fluctuate also with the years. The Ukrainian conflict story, it's a shorthand that I might have used. We prefer to use the terminology that the OSCE uses, conflict in and around Ukraine. We also used it in the survey. And again, numbers differ, but in most countries, overwhelming majorities think that Crimea was annexed illegally. But if you have a closer look, then maybe online or in our survey that you can pick here later, even in Germany, it's not such a small minority that think that Crimea wasn't annexed illegally, and it's interesting to see how the numbers differ. So yeah, there's not a uniform maybe response to this one. Yes, and how about the polling in Ukraine? This question, did polling in Ukraine include the self-proclaimed DNR and LNR? No. Our polling institute worked with a local partner, and as you may know, most or many of the current Ukrainian pollings are not conducted in the non-government controlled territories. But if you look at the map, it's comparatively a very small part, so the survey was conducted on the government-controlled Donbas area. Maybe an answer a question which was perhaps implicitly included in some of the questions. We did ask, for example, in Latvia or Ukraine, which language people prefer to speak. So, of course, we asked both Russian-speaking and the Ukrainian-speaking, or in Latvia, both the Russian-speaking and Latvian-speaking people. So, in general, it was obviously all inclusive and representative. In terms of how to bring these results to the policymakers, or how to make policymakers listen to their constituencies, to be honest, this is the question that we are wrapping our minds around. And through our work, and also through holding those public discussions, we actually try to draw attention of decision makers or their advisors or people somehow close to them on those results. Because indeed, and this is what we took from the discussions we had so far, there seems to be a big disconnect between what the public thinks and what the decision makers do, and often they seem not to be aware of public preferences. But also it should be conceded that foreign policy does not rank high on people's everyday priorities. I looked up the Georgian numbers, like what is your most important issue facing the country? 57% said it's unemployment, and then poverty, and only unresolved territorial conflicts. 6% of people think it's the most important issue facing the country. So in general, foreign policy issues don't seem to rank very high on people's agenda, and this is perhaps this little grain of salt that we need to keep in mind if we look at the results.
Yeah, there's one more question. What is the role of the EU in diminishing military confrontation between Russia and the US? Well, I would only answer according to the poll, because otherwise you get an opinion, and this is not my role here, even though I do have an opinion on that. I think according to the polls, it is that multilateral organizations are important. And here I would like to add something which was an assumption, and we had the discussion in Austria by an historian, nevertheless. If you compare the discussion we have today with 1913, a long time ago, or 1938, 1937, the mood, according to the poll, is much more peaceful. From the German experience, I can tell you in 1913, the Germans were very much into war. As we all know, unfortunately, 1937, 38, it was not that much different. According to this poll, this is not true. Thank God not for the Germans, but thank God also for the others. So this is quite a difference. And this is also partly the answer. What has that to do with the constituency of the politicians? There is no need to cater to those people who say, you know, we have to be belligerent if we have that. There is no need. People have a different approach to this. Since there's nothing more on this one, I think we have one question. If there's one question in this auditorium, so we have at least one public question. Yes, I don't know if you have a microphone. I give you mine. Oh, there's one.
Well, thank you very much.
It's on.
Thank you very much for the survey. Interesting presentation. Obviously, you know, if you ask the people if they want to have security rather than security, they would prefer security. If you ask them if they want peace or war, they would say peace. Or justice or injustice, they would say justice. The trick starts when these become contradictory goals. And you know, in this survey, people support taking each other's security interests into consideration, which partly means, of course, taking Russia's security concerns into consideration on the one hand. On the other hand, they want to respect upholding of international norms, right? And how these two can be sort of achieved together? Aren't they contradictory completely? Like, because Russia's security interest, as Russia defines it, is annexation of Crimea, dismembering of some of the countries, and how can you support that on the one hand and also support international norms on the other? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll try to respond to this very difficult question just briefly. Thank you, because what you say goes down to the very contradiction in the Paris Charter of the OSCE. On the one hand, you have the freedom of alliances. On the other hand, you have security considerations of your neighbors or indivisible security. And indeed, it's very difficult to reconcile. And obviously, our survey cannot capture this very delicate balance. We can just observe and in descriptive terms say this is what the people want, and the challenge remains. So I would say the challenge remains, and again, it's up to the expert community, us, to develop those ideas further, to draw on this and give proposals, and up to the politicians to see how to delicately balance it. And just maybe one more note in general on contradictions. This is something that another panelist, I think it was Sophia, who mentioned that in polls, people tend to support contradictory things. So if you give them a number of things to choose from, we see it on the example of attitudes to the conflict in and around Ukraine, who is to blame or how to solve it. Is it up to Russia? Is it up to the Ukraine itself? Is it up to a multilateral mechanism? People would strongly support multiple options. So these kinds of contradictions are inherent, and maybe you could say, okay, people are no experts in foreign policy, this is why the contradictions come. But I also think that it reflects the difficult balance and contradictions that are hard to rule out from international relations in general. So thanks for this point, but I can't give you a more we don't have a magic bullet out of the survey. There are two more questions.
Yeah, I just, well, the time is up. I said one question. I'm sorry, you can come to us. We're happy to discuss that. Same there, sorry about that. But one answer to you. Yes, there are contradictions in this survey. And please understand, and this goes for every survey, and we are very honest with this, this is not it. There are contradictions. You can ask differently. What we have done, we looked at all the surveys, or most of them, done before. We talked with the Institute. We basically phrased the question again and again and again to make sure the contradictions are going down, but they're still there. You're absolutely right. And if you phrase it different, possibly there will be a different answer. We know the weaknesses, and I'm saying, again, this is not it, but it's a trend. I think it could have been much different. And I expected from some countries definitely other answers. And something which might be lurking in your criticism on this, Latvia Don't we have a Russian minority? Yes, we do. And we will come up with another analysis on this, where the Russian-speaking minority and the Latvians are differing, but also, which we think is more interesting, where they don't differ. And this is coming up next. And I think Alexandra has said it already. This is the tip of the iceberg. This is a huge information database we have. This is the very beginning, and there will be more. And if you're interested, we'll send it to you. If not, not. But you can have a look on our website. I would like to finish pointing or coming back to what Felix had, my colleague here, said at the beginning, that this conference in Georgia in general is a hub for exchanging ideas. We are very much, and we use this word many times, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the Silk Road. I think this is one thing, this is very material, very important, but the other road, the road of ideas, I think this is something which Georgia can do very well, because you sit at a place where different opinions are going down on you almost every day. And for this, I think we have done also this presentation, but we are very thankful that we had the opportunity to present it here. Criticism, you can write to us. We hope we'll do this again in a couple of years. And we are thinking of exchanging a couple of countries, so possibly Georgia is the next. You can understand this. We're saying this in every country we go, that you are next. But Georgia is and was a candidate to come in instead of another country. So we would like to thank you. Thank you very much for the commentary. Thank you very much for the questions. And please, in the coffee break, we're very happy to quarrel with you. Thank you very much.